In the quiet coastal town of Seaside, Oregon, a darkness was brewing. A darkness that would expose the most horrific betrayal a child could ever know. December 20th. A date that would forever be etched in tragedy. 2-year-old Evangelina Wing had no idea her life was about to end. Imagine being so small, so vulnerable, so completely dependent on the very people who were supposed to protect you. And those same people? They were planning your destruction. Emergency responders would later describe a scene so brutal, so heartbreaking, that even hardened investigators would be shaken to their core. A child's body, covered in bruises. Injuries that told a story of prolonged, calculated abuse. Bite marks. Broken bones. A level of cruelty that defies human understanding. Dorothy Wing. 24 years old. A mother. But not in any way that word should mean. Randy Roden. Her boyfriend. A man who would become an architect of a child's suffering. This isn't just a story about murder. This is a story about how love can transform into the most terrifying weapon imaginable. How trust becomes a death sentence. How a child can be reduced to nothing more than a victim of unimaginable cruelty. 2 people. 1 defenseless child. 0 mercy. Who looks at a 2-year-old and sees something to destroy. What darkness lives inside those who can torture an innocent child? This is the story of Evangelina Wing. A story that will challenge everything you understand about human nature. A story that will make you question how such evil can exist. Welcome to Crime Scene Chronicles. This is where the darkest truths are uncovered. Where the voices of the victims are heard. Where justice is demanded. If you believe in bringing hidden crimes to light, if you believe stories like these need to be told, then make sure you hit the subscribe button. Turn on notifications so you never miss a case. New shocking stories every week, because the truth should never be buried. And we are just getting started. She was just 2 years old. She should have been playing with dolls, laughing in the warmth of her mother's arms, protected and loved. Instead, she spent her last moments alone, broken, suffering in the dark. On December 20, 2014 in Seaside, Oregon, emergency responders arrived at a home where they found 2-year-old Evangelina Wing, lifeless, cold, and covered in bruises. Her tiny body was stiff with rigor mortis, a chilling sign that she had been dead for hours before anyone even called for help. But Evangelina's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a monstrosity. Because the person who should have protected her, her own mother, was part of the nightmare. And the man who should have never been in her life, Dorothy Wing's boyfriend Randy Roden, was the architect of pure evil. What happened in that house? How did a toddler fall through the cracks of a system designed to protect her? And why, despite the warning signs, was Evangelina left in the hands of monsters? Evangelina's story isn't just about murder. It's about systemic failure. For months, neighbors and family members suspected something was wrong. Evangelina and her 2 older brothers were seen covered in bruises. They were starving, locked away, crying out for help. But no one stepped in. Not until it was too late. By the time police arrived, Evangelina was gone. Her tiny body told a story of unspeakable cruelty. Her mother, Dorothy Wing, claimed she never knew how bad things had gotten. Her boyfriend, Randy Roden, denied responsibility. But the truth? The truth was darker than anyone could have imagined. What makes a mother betray her own child? What makes a man turn into a monster, capable of torturing an innocent toddler? Psychologists call it coercive control. A slow poisoning of the mind. Dorothy Wing, a young mother, fell under the influence of a violent and dominant man. And in the process she did the unthinkable. She chose him over her children. She let him destroy them. And now we're left with a single haunting question. Was she a victim? Or was she just as evil? Imagine being 2 years old. Imagine crying out in hunger and pain, but no one comes to help. Imagine being locked in a dark room, waiting for a rescue that will never come. For Evangelina Wing, that was reality. For her 2 older brothers, torture was routine. But this wasn't a horror movie. This was real life. And Evangelina never survived it. How many more children are suffering in silence? How many more are crying behind closed doors, hidden behind smiles, covered in bruises that no one questions? This isn't just Evangelina's story. It's a warning. A wake-up call. Because somewhere, right now, another child is living in the same silent nightmare. And the only question that remains is, will we listen before it's too late? This is more than just a crime story. It's a warning. A reality check. A reminder that behind every headline is a real victim. Someone who was silenced too soon. If you believe stories like Evangelina's deserve to be told, then make sure you're part of the Crime Scene Chronicles community. Subscribe so you never miss an episode, because each story we uncover has the power to raise awareness and spark change. Like this video? It helps us reach more people, making sure these victims are never forgotten. Turn on notifications because the next story we tell might be one that saves a life. And if you think one more person needs to hear this story, share it. Because somewhere right now, another child like Evangelina is suffering. And maybe this time, someone will speak up before it's too late. Join us, hit the subscribe button, and like this video. Stay informed, because justice starts with awareness. To understand what happened to Evangelina Wing, we must first understand the woman who was supposed to protect her. Dorothy Wing wasn't always a mother. She wasn't always the woman whose name would be spoken with contempt in courtrooms and whispered about in the streets of Seaside, Oregon. She was once just another young woman, born into a world that didn't give her much. A world where survival often depended on the choices you made. And Dorothy? She made the worst possible choice. Growing up, Dorothy didn't have a perfect childhood. She came from a home that was no stranger to hardship, no stranger to struggle. Money was always tight. Her parents, working class, tired and overwhelmed, were trying to make ends meet. And in homes like that, sometimes love gets buried under stress. Sometimes neglect replaces nurture. Sometimes the cycle starts long before anyone realizes it's happening. As she grew older, Dorothy learned one thing. Life was about survival. She was young when she had her first child, too young to fully understand the weight of motherhood. And by the time Evangelina was born, she was already juggling the responsibilities of raising two older boys. The struggle wasn't just financial. It was emotional, psychological. A single mother barely keeping her head above water. And then, she met Randy Roden. A man who at first didn't seem like a nightmare. At first he seemed like a solution. But soon he became the worst problem she had ever faced. And he took her children down with her. Dorothy's life revolved around her 3 children. Her 2 sons. And little Evangelina. A child so small, so innocent, that the world had yet to stain her. Dorothy wasn't the kind of mother people looked at and immediately saw danger. She wasn't violent. She wasn't outwardly cruel. But sometimes the most dangerous parents aren't the ones who strike their children. They're the ones who allow monsters into their home. Before Randy entered the picture, Dorothy was just another struggling single mom. A woman trying her best. Her children were fed. They were clothed. They weren't living in luxury, but they had a home. Then everything changed. And the moment Randy Roden walked through that door, the countdown began. A countdown to pain. To suffering. To murder. Seaside, Oregon, a small coastal town. A place where life moved a little slower. A place where people knew their neighbors. Where the ocean breeze whispered through the streets. But for families like Dorothy's, it wasn't paradise. It was a trap. Seaside wasn't the kind of place where single mothers had a long list of opportunities. It wasn't the kind of town where struggling families could climb their way out of poverty. And for Dorothy, every day was a battle. She had 3 kids to care for. Bills stacking up. A paycheck that never seemed to stretch far enough. And the weight of it all? It was suffocating. She needed help. She needed a break. And when she met Randy Roden, she thought she had found one. But the truth? She had just invited death into her home. At first, Randy Roden seemed like the answer to everything. A strong man. A protector. Someone to ease the burden. Dorothy fell fast. Too fast. But that's how it happens, isn't it? At first he was charming. At first he was caring. At first he made her feel safe. But Randy Roden wasn't safe. He was a man with darkness inside of him. A man with a hunger for control. And Dorothy, whether she saw it or not, had just become his latest victim. And worse? She had handed over her children as well. The signs were there. But by the time Dorothy realized them, it was already too late. They say hindsight is 20/20. That when you look back the red flags seem obvious. But in the moment, they just look like moments. And that's what makes them so dangerous. Randy Roden didn't explode overnight. He didn't start out as a monster. Monsters never do. They build up, one warning sign at a time. He isolated her, told her that the world was against them, that only he could protect her. He controlled the money, every dollar, every decision, until she had nothing of her own. He had a temper, a way of making small things seem like big things, a way of making her feel like she was always wrong. He tested her, little acts of cruelty, seeing how far he could push before she would push back. And the worst part? She never did. So he kept going. And soon it wasn't just Dorothy who suffered. It was her children. It was Evangelina. To the outside world it's easy to ask, how could a mother let this happen? Why didn't she protect her children? But abuse, real abuse, isn't just physical. It's mental. It's emotional. It's slow and calculated. And when you break someone down long enough, they stop seeing the truth. They stop resisting. They stop fighting back. Dorothy wasn't innocent. She made choices. But those choices were shaped by something deeper. A cycle. A pattern. A history that she couldn't escape. And Randy Roden? He knew exactly how to use it against her. The most horrifying part of this story isn't just what happened to Evangelina. It's that it wasn't an accident. This kind of suffering? It gets passed down. Generation to generation. Dorothy came from a world of struggle. And she passed that struggle down to her children. But this time? It ended in death. When you have nothing, you will cling to anything that makes you feel safe. Even if it's a lie. Dorothy Wing wasn't wealthy. She wasn't educated. She was desperate. And desperate people make deals with the devil. Randy Roden was her devil. And by the time she realized it, her daughter was already gone. A healthy mind doesn't let a child suffer. A healthy mind doesn't watch bruises form and do nothing. Dorothy Wing's mind wasn't healthy. It had been twisted, manipulated, conditioned to accept the unacceptable. But when the time came to answer for her crimes, would she be seen as a victim? Or as a monster? The pieces were in place. The monster was inside the house. The mother was too broken to fight. And the children? They had nowhere to run. And soon, one of them wouldn't make it out alive. This is where the horror truly begins. Because before there was a crime scene, before there was a trial, before the world knew the name Evangelina Wing, there was Dorothy and Randy. A relationship that started as a promise and ended in blood. If you haven't already subscribed, click subscribe now. Turn on notifications. Share this video. These true crime stories save lives. One click and one share. Make a huge difference. To outsiders, Dorothy Wing and Randy Roden weren't an unusual couple. She was a struggling single mother. He was a man with a presence, tall, strong, dominant. At first he made her feel safe. That's how it always begins. With a smile. With a promise. With the feeling that maybe, just maybe, this is the person who will make life easier. Dorothy believed it. But the problem with trusting the wrong person? By the time you realize the truth, you're already trapped. Randy didn't fall in love. He took control. And Dorothy, whether she realized it or not, had already started to disappear. In every abusive relationship there's a shift. A moment when things stop being equal. A moment when one person stops being a partner and becomes a prisoner. And Dorothy Wing? She was about to lose everything. Randy had the power. It started small. A comment here, a correction there. A raised voice. A demand for obedience. But slowly it built into something darker. He controlled where she went, who she talked to, how she spent her money, and most importantly, how she raised her children. Dorothy didn't make the rules anymore. Randy did. And what Randy wanted was absolute control. Isolation. Dorothy stopped seeing old friends. Stopped reaching out to family. Her world shrank down to one person, Randy. Fear-based compliance. She stopped arguing. Stopped fighting back. She became quiet. Submissive. Threats and intimidation. Randy didn't have to hit her to make her afraid. A look was enough. A shift in his tone. The way his hands clenched into fists when something displeased him. Control over the children. He didn't just want Dorothy under his thumb, he wanted her kids too. And that is where this story turns deadly. Because when a violent man wants control over helpless children, the outcome is never good. Every abusive relationship has a boiling point. A moment when the pressure becomes too much to contain. Randy's anger had always been there, simmering, bubbling beneath the surface. But something was changing. Dorothy was slipping. She wasn't as obedient as she used to be. The children were growing, getting older, getting louder. And most dangerously of all, people were starting to notice. Neighbors, family members, teachers, the bruises on the children, the thin, malnourished frames of their bodies, the way they flinched when adults spoke too loudly. The signs were there. And Randy? He knew it. And in his mind there was only one solution. He needed to make an example. To remind everyone, Dorothy included, who was really in charge. And that's when he turned his full attention to Evangelina. Abusers don't always use fists. Sometimes they use words. Sometimes they use fear. And sometimes they use love as a weapon. Randy didn't just dominate Dorothy. He rewired her mind. Made her believe that she needed him. Made her believe that without him she was nothing. He used every psychological trick in the book. Gaslighting, making her doubt herself. Making her think she was crazy. Convincing her that the abuse wasn't real. Love bombing and withdrawal. Being sweet one moment then cold the next. Keeping her off balance, desperate for his approval. Breaking her spirit. Making her choose between him and her children. And every time she hesitated, he pushed harder. Until eventually, she stopped fighting. And when that happened, he had full control. And once he had control, the horror truly began. What we're looking at here is a textbook case of coercive control. When we analyze the timeline, we see a clear escalation. We see a pattern of violence. And most importantly, we see the moment where it turned deadly. The truth is, the abuse didn't start with Evangelina. It started long before she was even born. Randy had a history. A past filled with manipulation, control, power struggles. Women who had walked away. Women who had seen the red flags and ran. But Dorothy? She didn't run. And because of that, Evangelina never had a chance. Detectives believe that several key moments pushed Randy over the edge. The custody battle. Dorothy was beginning to lose control of her children. The growing suspicion. People were asking questions. Questions Randy didn't want to answer. Evangelina's helplessness. She was small. Defenseless. Easy to target. And in the twisted logic of an abuser, she became the perfect victim. A victim who couldn't fight back. A victim who couldn't run away. A victim who, no matter how much she cried, would never be heard. Randy wasn't just violent. He was calculated and cold. A predator with a hunger for power. Experts would later describe him as a pathological manipulator, someone who knew exactly how to bend people to his will. A sadist, someone who didn't just hurt people but enjoyed it. A ticking time bomb, a man who, if left unchecked, would have killed again. And Dorothy? She wasn't just his partner. She was his accomplice. She may not have pulled the trigger. She may not have swung the weapon. But when she let him stay, when she let him hurt her children, when she let him take Evangelina's life, she became just as guilty. Everything was in place. The manipulation. The control. The perfect victim. And then one night in a quiet house in Seaside, Oregon, Randy made his move. And by the time anyone realized what had happened, Evangelina was already gone. This is where the nightmare unfolds. This is where the warnings become wounds. Where bruises turn to scars. Where the suffering of a child who should have been protected, becomes something too horrific to ignore. This is the moment where Evangelina Wing's fate was sealed. And the worst part? It didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly, methodically, cruelly, until one day there was nothing left of her to hurt. It started with hunger. Evangelina and her brothers weren't fed the way children should be fed. The kitchen wasn't empty, but somehow, their plates always were. The food in the house belonged to Randy. And if he decided they weren't worthy of eating, they simply didn't eat. Evangelina's stomach would twist in hunger, small and fragile, crying for food. But no one answered. And soon she learned something. Crying made things worse. Because when she cried, that's when Randy got angry. And when Randy got angry, he needed someone to punish. The first time he hit her, it wasn't meant to kill her. It was meant to teach her. To remind her who was in charge. A slap. A push. A yank of the arm. To an adult it wouldn't seem like much. To a 2-year-old, it was the whole world collapsing in pain. And when he saw how easily she broke beneath his hands, he kept going. Over time the injuries became more frequent. More severe. Bruises bloomed across her skin, deep, dark, and unmistakable. Her small arms, too weak to fight back, became covered in finger-shaped marks. She began flinching at movement, cowering at footsteps. She was learning in the worst possible way that the world was not safe. That the only thing she could expect from the people around her was pain. And no one stopped it. Not her mother. Not the neighbors. Not even the people who suspected something was wrong. They all looked the other way. And while they looked away, Randy kept going. When investigators entered the house, they weren't just looking for answers. They were looking for the truth. And the truth was everywhere. Bloodstains, small, faint, but there. Dark patches on the carpet, on the walls. Proof that this wasn't a single act of violence. It was sustained. Repeated. Routine. And then there were the bruises. Deep and layered bruises. Some old, some new. Some healing, some fresh. This wasn't one bad night. This was a pattern. This was a ritual of suffering. And it had been going on for far longer than anyone wanted to admit. When doctors examined Evangelina's small, lifeless body, they expected horror. They weren't prepared for this. Her ribs fractured. Some had already healed, meaning they had been broken weeks before her death. Her arms, bruised and swollen. Signs of force. Signs of restraint. Signs of a child who had been held down. Her stomach, empty. No food. No nutrients. A body that had been starved. But the most horrifying part? Her head. Blunt force trauma. A skull fracture. And the cause of death? A final, violent impact to her tiny head. A blow so severe it left no chance of survival. Evangelina never stood a chance. And that's when investigators knew. This wasn't just abuse. This was murder. Step by step, injury by injury, the pieces came together. The starvation, food was a privilege, not a right. And Randy made sure Evangelina knew that. The beatings, a daily occurrence, growing worse over time. The neglect, left alone, left to cry, left to suffer in silence. The final night, when everything reached its breaking point. And the worst part? She was only 2 years old. 2 years. That's all she got. A childhood stolen. A future erased. Because one man wanted power. And because one mother let it happen. If Evangelina had survived, her life would have never been the same. Because abuse doesn't just leave scars on the skin. It leaves scars on the mind. Experts say that children raised in abusive households develop severe anxiety and fear responses, trust issues that last a lifetime, a distorted sense of love and safety, higher chances of becoming abuse victims later in life. But Evangelina never even got the chance to heal. Because the final beating took that chance away. And now the only thing left to do was bring her killers to justice. When prosecutors looked at the evidence, one thing was clear. This wasn't just neglect. This wasn't just bad parenting. This was systematic, prolonged, intentional torture. And the people responsible? Dorothy Wing and Randy Roden. But the question still lingered. Who was the real monster? Was it Randy, the man who struck the final blow? Or was it Dorothy, the woman who let it happen? That was for the courts to decide. But for the world watching? There was only one truth. Evangelina never had a choice. But now justice had to be served. A small, unassuming house in Seaside, Oregon. Inside that house, a nightmare was unfolding. This wasn't just the day Evangelina Wing died. It was the day her suffering ended. But it was also the day the truth finally came to light. And once investigators stepped inside that house, there was no going back. It began the way most tragedies do, with a choice. A choice made by Randy Roden. A choice that Dorothy Wing didn't stop. The details of that night would later be pieced together through forensic evidence, medical reports, and confessions. But the truth? It was written in blood. The night was cold. The house was silent. And somewhere inside, Evangelina was suffering. She had already endured days without proper food. Her tiny body was weak, frail, fragile. But Randy didn't care. To him she was a nuisance, a problem, an object. And that night he decided to erase her. Dorothy was home. Her sons were home. But no one stopped what was about to happen. It started with a scream. A small, helpless sound, a child in pain. Randy's patience had run out. Maybe she had cried too much. Maybe she had disobeyed in some small, meaningless way. Maybe he was simply looking for a reason. Because men like him don't need excuses. When Randy struck Evangelina, it wasn't a slap. It wasn't discipline. It was an attack. A punch. A violent, calculated blow to her tiny body. A force she had no chance of withstanding. She crashed to the ground. Tried to crawl away. But he wasn't done. There was another blow. Then another. Then another. And with each one she grew weaker. Her little body could only take so much. And then, a final strike to her head. The moment her skull fractured, everything stopped. Silence. Stillness. And then, nothing. When investigators entered the house, the truth was already written across the walls, the floors, the very air itself. Blood on the carpet. Faint splatter on the walls. Bruises layered over bruises, proof of past beatings. A cold, lifeless body in a dark room. This was not an accident. This was prolonged torture. And Evangelina had been living in hell. The medical examiner would later confirm the worst. Blunt force trauma to the head. A fatal impact. And most disturbingly, she had suffered for hours before she died. Her body had tried to keep going. Her heart had kept beating. But in the end, the damage was too much. She died alone. After Evangelina's body went still, after the violence ended, after the house returned to quiet, Randy felt nothing. There was no panic. No remorse. No hesitation. He had done exactly what he intended to do. And as for Dorothy, she didn't run. She didn't scream. She didn't try to save her daughter. Instead she waited. Waited hours before making a call. Hours where her daughter lay cold on the floor. Hours where she did nothing. By the time she finally called 911, Evangelina had been dead for a long, long time. When first responders arrived, the house was quiet. Too quiet. There were no signs of a struggle. No signs that anyone had even tried to save Evangelina. The moment paramedics touched her tiny body, they knew. She wasn't just gone. She had been gone for hours. Her skin was cold. Her muscles were stiff. The unmistakable grip of rigor mortis had already set in. One paramedic later recalled, "I knew before we even checked for a pulse. That baby had been dead a long time." And then they saw the bruises. They weren't just from tonight. They were old, layered deep. The signs of a child who had been beaten repeatedly. And suddenly, this wasn't just a death. It was a murder. The 911 call was brief. Emotionless. Dorothy's voice was flat and detached. As if she were reporting a broken appliance. Not the violent death of her child. First responders arrived within minutes. But it was already too late. When the paramedics examined Evangelina, they didn't rush to the ambulance. They didn't scramble to save her life. They knew there was nothing left to save. Instead, the house became a crime scene. A nightmare frozen in time. And as officers surveyed the evidence, one thought crossed their minds. How did no one stop this? Dorothy was questioned first. She was nervous and uncertain. Not because she was mourning, but because she was afraid. Afraid of what was about to happen to her. Afraid of what the police already knew. And then, there was Randy, who acted cold, emotionless and unbothered. He gave nothing away. No guilt, no regret, no fear. Because in his mind, he had won. He had gotten rid of Evangelina. And as far as he was concerned, there was nothing left to say. But the detectives knew better. And when the interrogation began, the truth started to unravel. The case wasn't over. Not yet. But one thing was certain. Justice was coming. The moment paramedics stepped into that house, the case changed. This was no longer a medical emergency. This was a homicide. And now the only thing left to do was to prove it. When the first officers arrived at the scene, they knew something was wrong. A mother calling for help hours after her child had died? A boyfriend too calm, too collected, too indifferent? And then, there were the injuries, the bruises, the fractures, the unmistakable signs of systematic, repeated abuse. This wasn't a one-time accident. This was torture. And whoever had done it had to pay. But law enforcement knew one thing. Randy Roden was a manipulator. And Dorothy Wing? She was broken, controlled and trapped between truth and terror. If detectives were going to build this case, they needed evidence. They needed proof. And most importantly, they needed one of them to break. The first step in any homicide investigation? The scene. Detectives combed through the house, searching for anything that could tell the real story of what happened to Evangelina. And what they found was horrifying. Bloodstains, faint but present. Evidence of previous violence. Old bruises on Evangelina's tiny body. She had been suffering for months. Malnourishment. Her body showed signs of starvation. A fractured skull. The final blow that ended her life. Then came the digital evidence. Search histories. Looking up injuries, child discipline, ways to avoid detection. Deleted messages. Conversations between Dorothy and Randy. Messages that hinted at control, at fear, at a toxic relationship spiraling into destruction. Financial records. Evidence that Randy controlled everything. Every new piece of evidence made one thing painfully clear. Evangelina never had a chance. And now, it was time to make someone pay. Evangelina's autopsy was more than just a report. It was a confession. Her body told the story she never got to tell. A story of pain. Of starvation. Of being beaten so many times that her bones had started to heal over past fractures. The forensic pathologist listed the injuries in chilling detail. Multiple broken ribs. Some old, some recent. Severe bruising on her abdomen, back, and legs. A skull fracture. The fatal injury. Internal bleeding. Signs of prolonged abuse. The final report left no doubt. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a fall. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was murder. And now the detectives had what they needed to move forward. It was time to start the interrogations. Dorothy Wing sat in the interrogation room, her hands folded in her lap. She wasn't hysterical. She wasn't demanding justice for her child. She was quiet, numb and disconnected. A detective sat across from her, patient, waiting and studying. And this time there was no escape. Then the first question. Dorothy, tell us what happened to your daughter. She swallowed hard, looked away. I don't know. A lot. The detective leaned forward. His voice was calm but firm. Dorothy, we know Evangelina didn't die naturally. We know she was beaten. We know she suffered. What we don't know is why you didn't stop it. Dorothy flinched. For the first time, her mask cracked. Tears welled up. But still she said nothing. Because she was still afraid. Afraid of Randy. Afraid of what would happen if she told the truth. But then the detective showed her the photos. The ones from Evangelina's autopsy. Her bruised body. Her broken bones. Her swollen face. And that's when Dorothy broke. She let out a choking sob. And whispered, I didn't mean for her to die. The detective's voice was sharp. But you let it happen. Dorothy nodded. And then she started talking. While Dorothy cracked under pressure, Randy Roden was a different story. He sat in the interrogation room, calm, collected, completely unmoved. Detectives studied him. His body language. His tone. His lack of emotion. Randy, we know what you did. I didn't do anything. A smirk. A shrug. Like he didn't have a care in the world. Evangelina was murdered. And we know it wasn't Dorothy. Then I guess you don't know anything. No guilt. No fear. No remorse. But then they showed him the evidence. The bruises. The fractured bones. The text messages. The testimonies. And slowly the smirk faded. Tell us the truth, Randy. He leaned back. Smirked again. You can prove what you want. But it doesn't bring her back, does it? That was the moment detectives knew. This man had no soul. And he needed to be locked away forever. With Dorothy's partial confession and the mountain of forensic evidence, the district attorney's office was ready. This wasn't just a murder case. It was a case about systematic child abuse, manipulation, and pure evil. The charges were severe. Randy Roden. Murder by abuse. felony murder, first-degree manslaughter, assault, criminal mistreatment. Dorothy Wing. First-degree manslaughter, criminal mistreatment. The trial would be explosive. The testimonies would be devastating. And when the jury saw the evidence, there would be no question. Randy and Dorothy had to pay. Because Evangelina deserved justice. And now she was finally going to get it. The trial of Randy Roden and Dorothy Wing wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was a reckoning. A chance for the world to see what had been done to Evangelina Wing. A chance for justice. And for everyone in that courtroom, there was no room for mercy. The lead prosecutor stood before the jury, hands folded, voice steady. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not just a case of murder. This is a case of prolonged, systematic child abuse. A case where a 2-year-old girl suffered at the hands of the very people who should have protected her. And by the end of this trial, you will know, without a shadow of a doubt, that Randy Roden and Dorothy Wing are guilty. Then she paused. Let the weight of those words settle. This is the face of the child they destroyed. She turned toward the screen behind her. And suddenly the courtroom was silent. Because there, in full color, was Evangelina. Not just a crime scene photo. Not just an autopsy image. But a picture of her before the suffering began. A little girl, smiling, innocent, alive. A little girl who would never smile again. And that's when the jury truly saw her. That's when the case became real. The defense's opening statement, a desperate attempt to shift blame. Randy's attorney was first. His voice was cold. The prosecution will tell you a story designed to make you emotional. But emotions do not decide guilt. There is no direct evidence linking Randy Roden to Evangelina's death. No witnesses saw him strike her. No confession. No indisputable proof. Then came the attack on Dorothy. What we do know is that Dorothy Wing was the primary caregiver. The person responsible for her children's well-being. And if there was abuse, why didn't she stop it? A carefully crafted sentence. A subtle shift. Trying to make the jury see Dorothy as the villain instead of Randy. Then it was Dorothy's defense attorney's turn. Ms. Wing was a victim of manipulation and coercion. She was terrified of Randy Roden. She was trapped. And by the end of this trial, you will understand that she was not the abuser. She was another victim. It was the only defense they had. But would the jury believe it? One by one, the prosecution introduced the hard evidence. Autopsy reports, crime scene photos, medical testimony, text messages, financial records proving Randy controlled everything. The forensic pathologist took the stand. Her voice was professional, emotionless. Evangelina Wing suffered repeated physical abuse over a period of months. The injuries are consistent with blunt force trauma, inflicted at different times. This was not an accident. Then she described the final blow. The force used to fracture Evangelina's skull was significant. It was a deliberate, targeted act. Death would have been inevitable. As she spoke, Dorothy looked down. But Randy? He showed no reaction. No remorse. No emotion. Because to him, none of this mattered. But to the jury? It mattered more than anything. Randy Roden, the predator with no soul. The prosecution's expert witness was a forensic psychologist. His task? To break down the mind of a killer. Randy Roden exhibits traits consistent with psychopathy. He lacks remorse. He lacks empathy. He derives control and satisfaction from dominance over others. In cases of prolonged abuse, perpetrators often seek to establish absolute power. This is exactly what we see here. Then he delivered the final blow. Randy Roden did not kill Evangelina in a moment of rage. He killed her because he wanted to. Because he could. Because he knew he could get away with it. The jury was silent. Because now they weren't just looking at a defendant. They were looking at a monster. Dorothy Wing, the broken mother or the accomplice. The defense brought in their own psychologist. Her goal? To paint Dorothy as a victim. Dorothy Wing suffered from battered woman syndrome. She was psychologically trapped in an abusive relationship and unable to leave. Victims in these situations often exhibit learned helplessness. Their survival depends on compliance. But the prosecutor had one question. Did Dorothy Wing have opportunities to save Evangelina? Pause. Then, a reluctant nod. Yes, she did. The prosecutor turned to the jury. That is why she is sitting here today. Because no matter how broken she was, she had a choice. And she chose to do nothing. The prosecution's strategy was simple. Show the jury Evangelina's suffering. Prove that Randy was the abuser. A harder job. Randy's attorneys had to create doubt. Dorothy's attorneys had to separate her from Randy. But the evidence was overwhelming. And the jury knew it. When it came time to deliver the charges, the weight of the moment was palpable. The judge's voice was steady. Randy Roden. Murder by abuse, guilty. Felony murder, guilty. First-degree manslaughter, guilty. Assault, guilty. Criminal mistreatment, guilty. Sentencing, life in prison. No parole. Randy showed no reaction. Because monsters don't feel fear. Dorothy Wing. First-degree manslaughter, guilty. Criminal mistreatment, guilty. Sentencing, 15 years in prison. Dorothy wept. But was it for Evangelina? Or was it for herself? The gavel slammed down. The case was closed. The jury had spoken. Randy and Dorothy were led away in handcuffs. And outside the courtroom, Evangelina's family breathed a sigh of relief. Because while nothing could bring her back, her suffering had not been forgotten. Justice had finally been served. And the monsters who took her life would never hurt another child again. Evangelina Wing's story isn't just a tragedy. It's a warning. Because she isn't the only one. Every day across the world, children suffer behind closed doors. And most of them will never be saved. Over 600,000 children in the United States are abused each year. More than 1,800 children die from abuse annually. 81% of child abuse deaths involve a parent or caregiver. Most child abuse cases go unreported. And here's the most terrifying statistic of all. For every one case that gets reported, dozens more go unnoticed. Just like Evangelina's did. Just like so many others will. Unless something changes. The system exists to protect children. But time and time again, it fails. What? Overloaded caseworkers. Social workers handle dozens, sometimes hundreds of cases at once. Lack of funding. Child welfare services are understaffed, underfunded, overwhelmed. Failure to follow up. Reports of suspected abuse aren't always investigated in time. The blind spot of domestic abuse. Many victims are trapped inside violent households with no way out. Evangelina Wing wasn't just a victim of her parents. She was a victim of a broken system. A system that should have saved her. But didn't? What if someone had stepped in? What if someone had noticed the signs? There are ways to prevent tragedies like this. Mandatory abuse education. Teachers, doctors, neighbors, they all need to know the warning signs. Stronger intervention laws. One report of suspected abuse should be enough to launch an immediate investigation. Community vigilance. If you see something, say something. Because waiting can cost a child their life. Just like it cost Evangelina hers. Why do children like Evangelina slip through the cracks? The truth is, the system isn't built to catch them. Not enough resources. Not enough follow-ups. Not enough urgency. The reality is this. If a 2-year-old child with visible bruises, clear malnutrition, and known domestic violence in the home can still die in agony, then the system isn't just failing. It's broken. And unless we do something, more children will suffer. More children will die. And the next time we hear a story like Evangelina's, it'll be too late. This isn't just a story. This is a responsibility. If you suspect a child is being abused, don't stay silent. National Child Abuse Hotline. Local social services. Community support networks. Emergency services if a child is in immediate danger. Because your voice could be the one that saves a life. The life that Evangelina never got to have. Her brothers survived. But what happens to the ones who live? What happens to children who grow up knowing they were supposed to die too? Evangelina's brothers weren't just witnesses to abuse. They were victims too. They felt the hunger. They felt the bruises. They felt the fear. And now, they will carry that fear for the rest of their lives. Because survivors never escape unscarred. They live with guilt, with nightmares, with questions that will never be answered. They will grow up haunted, because the sister they once played with is gone forever. When the truth came out, Seaside, Oregon wasn't just shocked. It was furious. Why didn't anyone step in? Why wasn't she saved? How did this happen in their own backyard? But the bigger question is, will anything change? Or will Evangelina just become another name on a long list of forgotten children? A child who grows up abused doesn't just forget. They don't just heal and move on. They carry the trauma into adulthood. Increased risk of mental illness. Higher likelihood of substance abuse. Greater chances of repeating the cycle. Because what you learn as a child becomes who you are as an adult. Unless someone breaks the cycle. Unless someone steps in before it's too late. Evangelina's story isn't just a tragedy. It's a wake-up call. Stronger child protection laws. Better resources for abuse victims. More accountability for parents and caregivers. Because if we don't fight for these children, who will? There was one final twist in this case. One last chilling realization. By the time Evangelina died, someone already knew. There had been warnings. Red flags. A neighbor who had noticed. A social worker who had concerns. And still, no one stopped it. Randy Roden wasn't just an abuser. He was a predator. A man who saw control as power. Who saw children as objects. And Dorothy? She wasn't just a bystander. She was complicit. Because fear is not an excuse for inaction. Not when a child's life is at stake. Evangelina Wing should have grown up. She should have gone to school. She should have played in the park. She should have had a future. Instead, she had a grave. And the only thing left to do is to make sure this never happens again. This is just one story. But there are thousands more. And if we don't talk about them, they will be forgotten. Want to uncover more shocking true crime stories? Subscribe now. Turn on notifications. Because the truth needs to be told. And we're just getting started.